Okay, so welcome to Christian Chain Art, a podcast that seeks to bring together some of the people and minds that are inspiring me in the field of movement, art, and transformation, and kind of have these conversations with the aim of enriching our creativity, our ways of being and doing in this world. So today I'm going to be speaking with Tom Weksler, a dancer, artist and teacher who greatly inspires me and has been involved in some of my recent work and projects. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you, Christian. Nice to be here.
Before we kind of get into the conversation, I just wanted to kind of go through a brief introduction so people can get a bit of your background and where we're coming from here.
Sure.
So Tom grew up in Israel and studied different forms of martial arts and acrobatic disciplines, delving into capoeira, and then later graduating from the workshop for dancers and choreographers in Haifa, Israel. And this kind of set the tone for some of Tom's journey in dance and performance, where he's been involved with various people, notably with Rootless Root. This is Joseph Fruchek and Linda's kind of artistic side of Fighting Monkey, which I'm also a great follower of. And they together performed Collective Loss of Memory in 2016. And Tom's performances also stem into duets, notably with Mayumo Minakawa, a Tokyo-based dancer and choreographer, who Tom has also created and performed with, I believe, in different countries, as well as his partner and collaborator, Rosé, who they're also kind of putting together some work and street performances together. So this is kind of some of Tom's performance background, and Tom is also a teacher of movement and movement workshops around the world. And this is the way I actually met Tom. So I attended one of Tom's workshops, Zen Acrobatics, a couple of years ago now in Valencia. And something that kind of comes to my mind strongly was the first thing he mentioned to me when we began the workshop. He said, "This is my craftsman's or my carpenter's workshop, and welcome. And here we're going to investigate, and I'm going to show you some of the tools and approaches that have been most relevant and enriching in my process of creation, of body, of dance, of art. And I want to kind of share these and rediscover these with you." So this kind of intro always stuck with me greatly, and I found it to be very kind of productive and warming learning experience. So fast forward a couple of years, and it was this impression that Tom left on me, not only from his approach in the workshop, but also into all the things that he was involving and bringing into this subject of the body and dance and movement, that led me to approach him to collaborate on my recent artistic project, The Essence of Movement, where we are capturing his motion, his movement, and evolving this into sculpture and different forms of art. So that's a little bit of my understanding of Tom's background and my journey into this. And yeah, hello again, Tom.
Hello, Christian. After
a long introduction.
Scroll down memory lane. That was nice.
So I kind of wanted to start at the beginning with memory lane, with your earliest memories. How did you fall into this path of what you do now in terms of working with dance and the body and movement? And what were some kind of key or pivotal moments for you in igniting this passion and trajectory?
Well, I think that everything, of course, everything is connected, and probably even as a kid, I didn't have kind of a single beginning. and I'm not saying it even as a, it's not on an abstract level. Very early on, my parents believed in a very, I think, a very kind of a broad education, which back then I used to think is a very common thing in Israel, but I learned I learned later that is not. So I was playing ball games twice a week. I was doing a karate kyokushinkai. I was doing swimming. They would take me to arts classes, chess. So and playing musical instrument, which I insisted that it will be percussion. It was all very, very broad from a very young age. It's almost like I don't remember myself almost at any point not learning something that later on has been influential on what I do nowadays. And I think it really thanks to my parents, because I grew up in a very, let's say, provincial area in the city of Haifa. And only when I became a teenager, I realized that this kind of broad education that I was receiving was not necessarily something that everybody shared. And I think I'm still, I don't know how it happened, and it's not that my parents had necessarily a conscious decision to do it. I think they came from the perspective that if they will propose to me something broad, I will get kind of pulled towards the things that I like the most. And I liked a lot of things, so I kept on with a lot of things. Most notably with this big mix, I remember that karate was like really, was really strong because there was a lot of kind of imagination involved. While the other things were, I enjoyed them, but it was more kind of, it was a bit more down to earth. Basketball and soccer was very big in Haifa, and of course playing the drum set. There was a lot of nowadays there's music everywhere, but karate there was kind of like this whole thing of a little bit of mythology, of stories of Japan. So it was kind of like it triggered my imagination. And also, and this is something that actually I haven't kept on in relation to the other sports for such a long time, but like also the arts classes, which they used to keep on trying different teacher, and I used to like drop out after a couple of months, but it kept on for a couple of years. And I think that there was something about my understanding of art already from a very early age that like you basically can do whatever you want, unlike the other things that I was doing. So even though as far as time investment, all of this broad kind of body of education that they allowed me was quite equal and quite well balanced. As far as what left like kind of an impact on my, at least on my memory and probably on my imagination as well, was the karate and the art classes.
Okay. And this is something that I've kind of heard you speak about in the past as well, like bringing together movement and art, and using these two as kind of lenses. So when you were like kind of embarking on this like karate journey, and there's obviously the physical undertaking, when did you start to feel like, and obviously you got into acrobatics and were doing capoeira and other kind of disciplines, when did you start to feel like, start to reflect on it from a more artistic perspective, or was that something that was born from the beginning in that sense?
Well, it's a very good question, and I think with this is already something that I know a bit less about myself than what I would say. I always remember myself really enjoying this aspect, which I think is something that not necessarily everybody that is talented as an athlete or physically talented enjoys so much, because there is a certain joy from athleticism that is very like, is very the raw moment, catching the ball in the right time, or dodging a punch in the right time, or shooting the ball exactly into the right spot. And it's not so much about like about like the underlayer and this, this interpretation that goes inside ourselves that is not specific to the moment. And then I remember always enjoying it, which was sometimes it was even helpful because I was always creative, but on other times it was something that was not necessarily relevant. Well, it was relevant for me, but at least not to the activity itself. If you know what I'm saying.
So it's like it's all hit you in the face.
yeah, exactly. So I think again, and it's something I considered myself like always I enjoyed my own creativity, but I was doubting my own ability for discipline. Which, if I look in retro, I was quite disciplined as well. But but in a kid's world, it's like it's like I like so much to I always thought that I like so much to dream about things, like kind of awake dreaming and seeing interpretations, and that if I wouldn't like it so much, I would really be good, but I couldn't stop.
So talk to me a little bit about discipline, because for the people listening who haven't seen Tom move and have only heard his voice now, this is how I first came across you. I saw you moving, and I saw a video called Home, which is available on YouTube. You can search for it. And when I see you move, I can see there's many years of discipline and hours and crafts kind of put into this. So how do you balance this idea of discipline and, let's say, training and practicing specific to that raw moment with the imaginative capacity? How do they come together for you?
Well, I think that this splits into two answers, because I think that nowadays, and maybe it's something that we'll return to also later in the conversation, but a lot of my and you also even noted it in the introduction. A lot of my approach is kind of to consider, if I have to simplify practice and creation and all of the projects that I do, I try to always kind of break it down into the aspect of the craft and the aspect of the art. And I think they're both kind of bringing up a different, first of all, different philosophies. And with different philosophies come different perspectives, but also different ways to act, to think about the actions, to react, and so forth. And if we go back to the story, which I think maybe on a movement perspective, it's relevant, I would say that the discipline is something that probably, at least with movement, is something that I learned when I joined capoeira. And I joined capoeira I joined to the school of Ido Portal, that is very famous nowadays. And I was studying there, I think for quite a lot of years, something between probably 8 to 10 years. And I think this was my first encounter with like raw discipline, like discipline, or even further, discipline for the sake of discipline. That is not because I knew, of course, from ball sports and from martial and from karate, I knew the importance of training something for something, for getting better, for the game, for winning. And then at Ido school, it was very clear that one of the important messages was like, we train hard for the sake of training hard, which is not something that I would say I carried on with in my adult life. But back then it was a very important lesson, because it allowed to deconstruct this thing of it allowed different causality, I think. That there is other aspects of the activity that only if you train really hard you see, and it's not necessarily connected to the results. And I think this was very much kind of the something I took from the time that I spent in his school.
It's kind of a little bit like now that at the time of this, we're still in quarantine during the coronavirus situation, and it's a bit like having now the four walls of your home to just look at, you start seeing different patterns in the marble, or you start noticing things you had never done before because you spend so much time. It kind of widens and opens up a greater awareness of what you're really doing, because you can actually practice something quite regularly without really meeting it fully in that sense. So I guess that breaks that boundary.
Totally.
And what were the hours like? What when you were practicing discipline for discipline's sake? Like, how hardcore did it get, or what was it? What did it look like?
Well, I mean, so again, when I joined the school, I was already coming from being very, very like, my parents kept me really busy. And I think that like what was the difference is that basically at certain point I dropped all the other activities that I do in order to train in this school. And I don't remember exactly also because back then it transformed a little bit. It started in kind of a community center gym, and then like he opened his own studio, which allowed him more freedom with the hours and so forth. But it reached in my teenage years, when I was like probably 16 or 17, I would train every day, after school. Instead of doing homework, I would go, I would teach there. I would do like I would do like the teenage class, the adult class, which was 4 hours. I would teach probably 2 hours beforehand. Sometimes we would go to do acrobatics or meditation or something like this on the beach before school. It was like all my free time was dedicated to training, except for the weekends. So I could do, something that, I don't know, 20, 30 hours of training a week.
Okay.
Which was a lot, considering, not that I was doing so well at school back then, but like it was a lot for somebody that's basically a high school student.
Okay. And you've mentioned Japan a few times. And when I was doing research on kind of what to ask you or where to kind of guide this conversation, I grew curious to know, firstly, about your relationship to Japan and time spent there, and also particularly to this quote that I found of Miyamoto Musashi. Which says, I'm going to read it now, it's quite a mouthful, but pay close attention to the state of your mind and do not worry about your body. Fill any spaces where your mind is lacking, but do not allow it to become overfull at all. Understand thoroughly how a small body can become large in spirit, and know a large body can be completely small in spirit. Whether large or small, set your mind straight. Having a mind that is not controlled by your body is essential. So
that is beautiful. You also read it with completely the right tone, I feel.
So this is something that I kind of when I was at your workshop, it was permeating the experience. This kind of it was called Zen acrobatics, So I was curious about your relationship to Japan and these sorts of teachings and what they mean to you today.
I mean, well, it's nice because we're doing this interview, but we already know each other and work together, and it's a joke between me and my partner Rose that like that the magic word is Japan. She's always like, if we go to meet with friends and like, and somebody mentions Japan, and she's like, okay, here Tom goes, and, like, who said the magic word? I mean, I don't know. There's like, this is really something that like has been with me throughout my whole life. Like I was always, I always had a certain admiration for the mythology, for the stories. Another good thing that I can take from my parents' house is my dad. He loved classical cinema, so he taught me about the work of Akira Kurosawa when I was like 12. And like how Western cinema was inspired by it. And then in karate, we all of the stories, like, also about Okinawa and about the development of jiu-jitsu. It was really, I had a lot of input, So I was reading stories about samurai. I was and of course manga, anime. I mean, I had a lot of kind of cultural context throughout my childhood, and then I think that my first encounter was when I was dancing professionally for Inbal Pinto and Avshalom Polak Dance Company, and we went on quite a long tour to Japan. We started in Matsumoto, then we went to I don't remember. We went to another place and then to Tokyo. We performed in 3 cities. So we're in Japan for almost like 2.5 weeks or 3 weeks on a tour, and we had a bunch of free time. And for me, it was amazing. You know, it was like on one hand, I could kind of live all of the things that I heard about. You know, like the temples, the nature, but also be exposed to all of the things that are like, you know, crushing the image of a Westerner and thinking about Japan, which is like, you know, the technology, the pace, and all of the incredible amount of energy consumption, which is like crazy. And I mean, the whole extremity of it was so charming for me. And then after I finished my contract with Inbal Pinto, I started to spend more time there in Japan. So I think that between ages to 25 to 28, I mean, I also lived there occasionally for a few months at a time. Every time that I didn't have work in Europe, I would go there for 2-3 months at a time. And I was also working a bit of Japan. So yeah, so the whole familiarity became bigger and bigger. I think that like if I have to, except for all of the culture that I learned about when I was a kid, as an Israeli, there was something about the culture that was very charming for me. Israel is a very young country, and a lot of the behavior is so much about like, you know, I like to say that it's hard to accept the preservance from people who've been living in the same country only for 70 years, only for 60 years. You know, like it's hard to understand what are you supposed to preserve because everything is so new, everything is so immediate. And I think also that's the Israeli, it affects a lot the Israeli character. Israelis are very sharp. The Israeli culture is considered very rude in a lot of occasions, but on the other hand, very efficient, like right to the point and so on. And then Japan is almost like, it can seem almost the complete opposite because it's so folklore based, and it's so, there's so many customs, you know, customs and respect are always overcoming logic, while in Israel, personal logic is like always high in the priority. And it was just like I couldn't grasp it, and this curiosity is what triggered like me spending so much time there and learning about the language, because this curiosity, the more I spent time there, and I remember in this tour, that is also where I met my Buto teacher the first time. Which was, again, when was it? I think it must have been 2014, 2013. And like, I thought that after these 2.5 weeks of touring, I would just understand a little bit more and then like, you know, move on with my life. But it just like opened up this huge, like I understood much less after these 2.5 weeks, I felt. And I think that like me trying to come closer, trying to understand, and even what I told you now about the culture, about how somebody with like such a different capacity and different makeup can adapt myself to this. How can I learn to respect? How can I learn perseverance? I think it was very fundamental in this. And I think and all of this connect also to the quote that I use in the website, this Miyamoto Musashi quote. It relates about to a certain way to look at our own minds, which is probably what nowadays is almost like the thing that I'm most curious about, like, you know, that what is our human mind and how do we perceive it? Because I think that how we perceive it is also what creates it. And this experience of Japan kind of forced me to ask these questions. And maybe subconsciously, I knew that would be the only thing that would, force me to ask this question.
Hmm. Yeah, it's almost like when you hurl yourself into a new cultural extreme, it kind of it generates these new spaces to actually ask these vital questions, which we might have not been so curious or brave to look at living within a repetitive cultural model.
Absolutely. And you also, I know that you have been through this like different pulls and pushes from cultural contexts around the world. So you must understand the driving force there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I'm kind of I recently went on a trip to Asia before this whole virus situation to visit some of my family there who are from Malaysia, and it had been a while since I had really traveled because I had settled for some years in Spain, and before that I was traveling a lot on a regular basis, and I was really reminded of the power of being exposed to different smells and the biological impact of just being in a different place, and how that starts to just completely transform the way you're reflecting on things, the way you're thinking, the way you're relating. I think mimicking is also a huge thing, and like the cultural body language, and like
Totally.
you pick up things and you adopt things because it's part of that dance, you just wear those roles for a little bit, and then you come back to your normal life and everything's changed all of a sudden, but it's the same place, it's the same thing. So I think that's the kind of plasticity of mind body that happens when we travel.
Definitely.
So okay, and so I wanted to now move a little bit into your teaching. So we've covered a little bit of your history and paths into performance and Japan and this kind of inspiration. And just before we get into some of the kind of key principles and philosophies around your teaching, I just wanted you to maybe outline for people who aren't familiar with your teaching format and the different kind of approaches or styles of teaching that you have, just to give a bit of an architecture.
Yeah, definitely. So as I said, the ground for everything is the kind of this perspectives of art and craft. So I teach craft and I teach art, and then on top of this, there's what is called movement archery, which I would say that movement archery in its essence is to teach people through movement tools to look at their own body within these two perspectives. So it's like everybody has a body, everybody enjoys certain things about their body. How do we use those things that we enjoy, that we're attracted to, that are available to us in an artistic context and in a craftsman or craftswoman context? So in that sense, that's kind of the most wide teaching body that I offer. And then within this, there's different, it has different pieces. I'm talking a lot about warm up and priming, a lot about improvisation and fixed material, a lot about technique, and a lot about communication. So this would be kind of the within movement archery, the pieces that compose it. And then aside from this, there's Zen acrobatics, which you have experienced. That Zen acrobatics is basically, kind of the name is quite straightforward, I think, but it doesn't make any sense. I think from the way that I know Zen and I know acrobatics, this combination doesn't make sense. But it is my experience with these two things. And it's basically working with a certain, you can say, taking risks as a life practice. So it starts, of course, it's not starts, it's based on, of course, on actual movement, that, you know, how we move in a way that allow us to take risks, that takes risk as a fundamental, while being very very calm, very tranquil, and in that way, you know, make them something that is harmonious with life, rather than something that is like kind of special events that, like, you know, that change everything.
That's something that just to deviate for a second, that's something that I experienced and saw a lot in the way that you move, and what was being cultivated in the workshop that we were in. This idea of like keeping that calmness within the intensity, like keeping that mindfulness even in the fully fledged or fully released acrobatic movement, you know. So maybe you could expand a little bit on the importance of that.
Sure. I think that, like, you know, in order not to make it too abstract, I can, you know, go to one of the you know, the first acts that I would work with anybody who wants to study like this idea of minds and acrobatics. And this is, let's take any acrobatic movement, and not only let's take any acrobatic movement in any type of school. And here, West and East doesn't matter, because they're very similar. You have to learn a certain certain sequence of actions, which usually would be something in the form of preparation, climax, landing. And it doesn't, and usually the vision is that if you will get really, really good at preparation, climax, and landing, you will have control to do anything you want before and anything you want after. And I have a lot of, I have a different proposition, let's say, and that it's, you have to forget in a certain way about the preparation, climax, and landing, and consider, for example, and I have a couple of propositions like this, trajectory of movement before and trajectory of movement after. If you consider the trajectory of movement before and the trajectory after, you don't need to change your mindset into something that is almost like, you know, foreign to what was before and what was after. So, you know, I run forward, and after whatever I will do, I roll forward. I run forward, I roll forward, I run sideways. Rather than I run forward, I prepare, I do the middle, you know, the middle of the roll or the middle of the flip, I land, and then I run sideways. So the whole thing allows a different space and a different relationship. So in that sense, that's already something that is changing a lot of, you know, how one would approach doing something that is risky. You know, now, of course, that there's no, and this is why I said also that in this workshop is a very craft-oriented workshop, because in order to do it, you have to know what you're doing very well, which means changing the preparation, climax, landing in trajectories doesn't mean that the work is easier necessarily. It's just different. I would still have to understand very fully what is the risk of, we took the example of rolling forward, but let's take even a forward flip, you know, what's the risk? Okay, like if I miss the trajectory, what can happen to me? You know, what should I be aware of? What are other possibilities of changing the direction, and so on and so on and so on. And so I think that there is a lot of kind of, it's still a very thorough work. But in my experience, it completely allows the experience of acrobatics to be connected to almost any type of movement. So if you want even to illustrate it more, the preparation, climax, landing is very, very common in gymnastics. And in gymnastics, you get to a certain level of mastery of it. You know, you see gymnasts, you see it's beautiful. You know, it's like, it's amazing. It's stunning. You know, take a deep breath, prepare the posture, shift a little bit forward, bam, run, make preparation moves, go to this amazing height, do, tsukara, whatever it is that happens in the air, and then land. And if they manage to land perfectly, they get even a 10. And it's amazing. But it's very, very hard, from my experience, to take this this way of this relationship with the move, with the risk, with the difficulty, and then transform it into a new context, into a different context. It's very hard to do gymnastics even on a different floor. It's very hard to dance and do gymnastics, and again, it's not an original idea of mine. If you look at a lot of the progressions of what the original parkour artists, Yamakasi, David Bell, and Cyril Raffaelli, what they brought, which was like, the integration of trajectories rather than isolated moves.
I like the analogy that Joseph Fruchek makes about this from Fighting Monkey. He says, do we want to train to be a lab rat or a street rat? So the lab rat is an animal that is raised in a kind of very controlled and sterile conditions and can perform perfectly and can complete the maze with 300 IQ if the super rats, if needs be. But take it to the street and it's this difficult, complex, slippery, oily, scary environment which it's not so prepared for, and its preparation, climax, and landing doesn't quite translate over, whereas the street rat kind of walks around with a limp and isn't as aesthetically beautiful in some sense, but kind of survives and even thrives when faced with chaos. Do you see kind of resemblance in that analogy? Or
yeah, I mean, I see resemblance. Also I think that always Joseph's imagery and metaphors are always wonderful. I think I see resemblance. I think what I would add is that there is still this is why, again, it's a craft. There's still the thorough work. So still there is a certain specificity that needs to be addressed, regardless of the approach, because we're talking about I don't think that acrobatics in that sense it's something that is natural. I don't think that and in that sense, not any street rat would turn into David Bell. David Bell had to have a certain objective. It was very clear, and it was despite the circumstances of the street, not because of the of course later on it's gotten better, and also I don't want to get into the history of parkour and John Abri and all of this, but I just want to say that regardless of the context, this is something that a person would need to address. How do I integrate this? And it might be that if you're a street rat, you would need to consciously integrate acrobatics, which is something that would seem like it doesn't make any sense. And I think that's a little bit here the difference. That I'm not saying that this approach would prepare anyone for anything. I'm just saying that whatever it is that you're training, the question, how do I from the beginning until the end consider the possibility of integrating it into different perspectives and different circumstances, this would give me along the way more freedom. And for that needs to be a lot of work, lots of study, and also a certain objective. So I think that it's close, but there is a little bit of a difference here.
I see. And kind of connected to this point, I wanted to talk about technique and expression, and kind of relate it into a general format as well, but also discover it through the specificity of your work.
Yeah.
So kind of as creators, and even there's a quote that from Picasso that goes, learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. There's this kind of idea that you first learn the rule, You go to art school, you learn how to draw the perfect body and nipple and everything, and then you can then start abstracting and break the rules, right?
Yeah.
Even when I started to learn to paint, that my teacher actually, it's interesting, had a strong bias to creativity. So maybe we didn't spend enough time actually learning the skill. We went straight out into discover our own voice within this. So
Yeah.
I want to. I think there's a spectrum here, right? But I wanted to kind of hear your relation towards this and also understand it practically. So in your own training and in your own practice, like how much are you mentally investing time in a structure of, okay, I'm going to work on this specific movement vocabulary here with these kind of principles in mind, and then something is going to be like, okay, I'm really just going to try and explore expression and something totally different and much more theatrical today? Or do you split it when you structure it, when you teach it? How do you relate to this idea of technique and play or expression?
It's a big question. I think that if I will start from the answer before, because it can help even give a bit more context, and then I'll try to give another example. So we talked about acrobatics, for example, and then like having this thing in mind of I want to be able to express my acrobatics in different contexts. And usually what will happen is that there will be sooner or later the context that wouldn't make sense, or the expression in a context that doesn't make sense. So I want to express myself on a ground that is not straight, for example. And then all of a sudden I learn that a lot of my vocabulary doesn't fit. I want to go to soft ground, to strong ground. With it, which that's we didn't get there, but that would be the third workshop. We can talk about it later, about communication. But I want to communicate with something. Usually it shows me exactly my limitations with what I already have within my expression. And this would be a moment that would call for specificity. I'm missing something, and the question, what am I missing, is usually a great opportunity for specificity. Now, in general, I think that the philosophy and objectives, they are very good tools to kind of create a framework. So there is a question and there is an objective, and then on the way, regardless of how much I believe, I have faith in open format, or how much I have faith in systematic approach, the path from my philosophy to my objective will call for a change of strategy here and there. And nowadays my specificity is based on this. So if I want to create something as a choreographer, I want to find a new movement transition, a new trajectory. I want to make something that I used to do high, low. I want to make everything that I do low, higher, stuff like this. And usually when I do these things, when my expression is being pushed to a place that I didn't know before, this is very easy for me to see what I lack. So I think that in that sense, technique for me is always the question, okay, where do I stand now? Where do I want to stand later? And technique would be the tools that take me from where I stand now to where I stand later. And it's something that is dynamic, it's ever changing, because if I start a certain process now, I'm not standing in where I was standing 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and I don't believe that everything progresses. I don't think that everything decays. I think that everything is a mix. So questioning where do I stand, which can be this thing of like, what is my philosophy? Where do I stand now? What do I think now? What do I say now? What do I want? And then the point that this is what I want. I want to get there, and then here usually comes the necessity to call for techniques, the tools to get there. And from my experience, and also I base a lot my pedagogy, the more specific the goal, the more open techniques will be necessary, need to be applied. And the more open the goal, the more I would need specific techniques. Which is interesting. And this is a little bit that, it's like kind of this thing of perception. Like if I want to do now, I want to take my, not so long ago, I was working on, it's already quite a long time ago, but I was working on landing a kick into a backflip and 2 twists, double cork. And I wanted to do it on a hard floor. And the study, the simple study of like just just the mechanics of it, just the different actions and the timing was quite clear to me, and despite of how much I did it more and more and more, I couldn't really make it. And what allowed me to take it is start to open it, to ask, okay, how do I, for example, condition myself to it? And I start working on different types of jumps, different types of landing, to strengthen, to stretch, to do a bunch of things that would seem like very, very open in relation to the goal that I had in hand. But this opening, was taking me much further. Now, on the other hand, like working on, for example, on communicating a move, usually would go down to something very, very specific. I want to use a role in a dance or martial arts context. It will be a very, very specific study of distance, timing, and risk. And like it will almost lead to the specificity of the rules. If I do it too close to the other person, I kick them in the face. If I do it too far, I'm not communicating anymore, and so on and so on. So it's like within it goes down to a certain specific distance, specific time that it makes sense, and so on. So this kind of openness and specificity, it's things that by themselves, without me making big theories about them, are kind of, move me, if that makes any sense. And usually in a certain way of polarities rather than fitting.
Yeah, I definitely resonate with that, in that every day and every situation is a different one, and we need to adopt a different strategy in order to thrive in it, in a sense. And also going back to the point about learning and motivation, it's kind of like when you mentioned, when I feel I've run out of tools here, I'm expressing myself, I'm communicating with the floor, I'm doing this, and then I feel there's an area which I need to then invest specificity in. I feel that can be a very that can be a good source of motivation, because you now have a context to know why you're learning something. We've talked very far into the curriculum of a very progressive education system in this conversation, right? I hope. But the way I was educated at school and in university, and the way the majority of the learning systems that the planet are engaging in right now involves learning material, a lot of the time outside of context or risk, binding this in the hope that we will be prepared for everything, and I think it takes courage, and it can almost be stressful to at first to have to be open to multiple strategies, and the possibility that maybe today specificity work, maybe tomorrow that will not work, and I need something completely different, to thrive in the situation. So
totally.
Yeah.
I mean, it's also like, I think that it's not necessarily like, I think that progressive education, and what education needs, is exactly what you said, is the capacity to appreciate multiple strategies, because I don't think that there is any strategy that is bad by itself. You know, like the nowadays, I think we're being so loaded with information that all the time the question is, what is the best information? There's never the best information. There's never the best strategy. There's strategy that is contextual and fit this or fit that. You know, I back if I pull back to the story, in Japan, one of the most interesting things in learning the language for me was that you have on a daily life like 4 or 5 ways that you can say I. You know, there's watashi, which is completely neutral, and then me, I was using sometimes boku. That boku is a bit more something that like kind of men would use. But then also in a very formal conversation, somebody can use ore, which ore is like something that only a boss would say. And there's also atashi, which is not so much my character, but it's like if you're cute and something that would be like maybe a bit more like a kind of traditionally feminine. And it keeps on, and you know, people who know Japanese well, they know up to like 11, 12, and I heard somewhere that there's like 19 or 21 to say I. And then as a Westerner, so which one fits me the most? Then the answer that you get if you have a good Japanese teacher is like, it depends on the situation. You know, you cannot say this type of I in all situations, you know. And I think that learning needs to be more based on this. I got back recently to writing a lot, and I'm working a lot to improve my writing because I feel that my teaching, the better I write, the better I teach somehow. And also the better I create. I feel choreography and teaching are both very connected to writing. And I'm taking all these internet courses and like, you know, and I'm doing all these exercises. And recently I realized that the thing that like kind of opens doors the most for me is to pick up new words, which is like, you know, it's kind of the lesson of literature that I remember from age 14. You know, they didn't make any sense back then. Like, how do you even get better at writing by knowing a fancy word, you know? But now in my context, when I'm so used to like develop ideas, you know, kind of freely, learning a new word almost like pulls everything down to a specific idea, which is amazing. It was a strategy that never improved my writing until now. What does it say about the strategy? Nothing. The strategy is the strategy. The technique is the technique. I'm just standing now in a place that I never stood before with an objective that I didn't have before. And the lack of understanding this, you know, which also implies, of course, that learning, because you said that, like, you know, formal education is supposed to prepare you for something. Like, this idea is already a bit tricky. It's like, it's an ongoing thing, you know. You don't reach objectives and then life is over. You achieve things, of course, processes, they do come to a certain resolution, but the process coming to a resolution doesn't end all the processes, doesn't, you know, kill all the space for, you know, on the contrary, it's ongoing, it's fluent, it continues and continues. So, you know, so thinking about learning as multiple processes that will go on and on and on and on and on with different changes is something that I feel a lot of pedagogical bodies are missing.
Just to turn the page now, I wanted to get into, we could go on down the education.
Yeah.
But I feel I'm curious as well about the communication, which we kind of picked up during this stream of thought. That's the other body of your teaching, as I understand it. I think it's called the natures of partners or the natures of partnership.
It's nice. Both names are nice. It's the natures of partnering.
Okay, the natures of partnering. Okay.
Yeah.
And I wanted to learn, well, just to give an example as well, because I feel we both have a tendency to go very abstract with things.
Yeah. Fair enough.
When I was at your workshop, we were doing we were exploring some of these principles through movement, and one of the exercises was to move with the empty spaces that your dance partner is kind of creating. So we were in these kind of one-on-one interactive dance formats or games,
Yeah.
And we would have to just kind of interact with the spaces, and sometimes your partner would kind of, there'd be an awkward moment where the communication isn't flowing, and other times they would kind of, okay, there's a rhythm, I'm inviting you, you come here, okay, you lead, I lead. There's this whole kind of process of communication that happens, and for me it was very interesting to see how I'm not listening sometimes, or and speaking too much, or how I'm sometimes not taking ownership of the situation and presenting something into the nothing,
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I was curious about what you thought on this, and how you see communication and the body as connected in our humanity.
Well, first of all, the natures of partnering is a body of work that I don't develop alone. It would be quite ironical if I make. I'm teaching communication alone. I mean, possible. But so it's like this is something that I developed in the past 3 years with my partner, Rosette Tutuzaus, that she's also a dancer and choreographer, and we also create together. We also choreograph together. So, but somehow that's the only workshop that we teach together. The other two I don't teach. Like we can co-teach, but it's more like it's less of a shared creation than this one. This one is really, there's nothing I can say about the natures of partnering that is just me. It's all shared. It's all collaborative, and I think this exactly points to the essence of the workshop, is like kind of to perceive yourself, if we go back to the Japanese of the multiple eyes, as a constant we rather than an I, and we create the context and the framework that allows this. And I think it's very interesting. And if we go back to learning, if we go back to creative process, and almost any skill development, when it's being contextualized into something that you communicate, when it's being contextualized into a we, it completely changes kind of the objective and also the necessities. So, for example, this exercise that you spoke about, that of moving in the empty space, is on one hand, when you think about it at the beginning, it's like, okay, I can, usually we use this score of like you move between different architectures and you give a little pause in the architecture. So there is a time for your partner to also explore the empty space, and to know that that's the time that there is a possibility for only one of us to move and the other one to make the space. So it's like, okay, I can just move between architectures and my partner will adapt. But then very quickly you realize that you cannot just move. You all the time need to be in kind of a constant listening and constant reading of also what the other partner is doing. So it seems that everything is possible, but all of a sudden everything is still possible, but very differently possible. And I think that this is very also important in the context of teaching art, because in a way there's a very good question about art, whether it's art if nobody sees, hears, or ever exposed to it. And then you can say like, well, depends on the intention. So what about something that's being created without the intention of communicating? Is it still art? And not that I have answers to the question, but I think that practicing this kind of movement together, movement as a tool for communication, movement as a we, puts a lot of light on this question, what is art? Because whether we stay on this question or not, it's very clear that the artistic process benefits a lot from something that you show, you tell, you play for someone. When there's witnessing, and and even I can take it even further and say, even if I shift perspectives, I write something and then I act as the reader, I act as the witness. The thing of of the creation and the witness as something that is interlaced and integrated into one another as a we, in my opinion, is something that is very, very fundamental in order understanding art. And that's kind of the idea behind the natures of partnering. Then just on a technical note, I've been always involved in martial arts, in dance. Like we spoke about acrobatics as a start, but I never practiced exclusive acrobatics, which means I never in my life had a phase that I'm only practicing individual moves. There was always communication. So for me, this is something that is extremely fundamental. And this usually also my objectives are being found there in the space of the communication, in the space of the we. So I'm not exactly sure what to make out of it, but if we said that kind of we start from the teaching and movement archery is kind of a wide base, and then Zen acrobatics is really about the craft. For me, Natures of Partnering is really about the art. The art of expressing yourself and having a witness for this expression.
And something that also comes to me and that I experienced in your workshop and in other dance festivals and things I've participated in is kind of like the community of it, the capoeira circle, the how dance or expressing yourself in motion with another human is possibly older than language, and dance is part of a lot of tribalistic cultures, and we danced around the fire. You see things like shamanic dance. It was kind of a way of prayer, of worship, of bonding, a social glue almost, so I think that's also another interesting angle to look at it from, when two seemingly opposed forces abandon preconceived ideas and get lost in what is the nature of play, the nature of dance, like we do when we're kids, like we do when we find closeness and vulnerability with people. It kind of melts away everything into kind of the essential quality of art and back into that space you kind of speak of as well, I guess.
I think that, in a teaching context, that's probably in my opinion, the most important role of a teacher is to hold a space that allow people to experience a community. I think that this is even if it's a community of just the teacher and the student, it's like the creation of a subculture. All of the teachers, the great teachers that I had in my life, and the more recent one, there was Yoshito Ono, who passed, which was my Buto teacher, Takamasa Watanabe, my Jiu-Jitsu teacher, my good friend Joji Tapuaberama, which was not my teacher, but I learned a lot from him about teaching. The most, when you see how they hold space, the first and foremost, most striking thing is how much the space manages itself in a special way without them manipulating it. And I think this is extremely important. It's a very I feel it's something that can easily disappear in the world of easily and transferable information. So of course, that also me and Jose, we try to do it when we teach partnering, and I also try to do it in other contexts of teaching. But I think in general, it's a really nice point that you bring up of how much importance is this kind of feeling of community and a space work together in a special way, a space full of people, or a occupied space work together in a special way through a learning process. Because it's not this type of community, this type of learning community or practice community is not something that that you can have outside of this context of the teaching, in my opinion. And it's a very interesting topic, and I think that that there's a lot of gain from reflecting on it.
Okay, and so to keep moving forwards, I wanted to also now kind of take a moment to reflect on our art project together. Yes. And I'll just kind of explain a little bit about it for those who are not so familiar with it and the process. So The project is called The Essence of Movement, and it's trying to bring this essential quality or communicative quality of movement that we've been kind of, this undefinable aspect that we've been talking about, and trying to see how we can kind of tap into this to generate different art formats. So in order to do this, I approached Tom at the end of last year, and we recorded his dance using motion capture technology. And the idea here is to use this data, use this invisible landscape that he generated with his dance to create sculptures and different 2D art pieces. So this is kind of the idea, taking the data of the dancer and bringing it, expressing it into different forms of sculptural and visual art. And something which perhaps was seeded in the first workshop that I went to with Tom, in my first physical interaction with him, was this concept of wabi-sabi, where he talked about it, this Japanese term for, I'm going to kind of butcher it here, but letting the imperfections of nature, honoring them and allowing, if you're creating a plate or a pot and there's a certain crack in it, kind of, instead of covering it up in a perfect IKEA plate, like allowing it to kind of have that character and that nature, and allowing the process to follow the natural forces that underpin it to an extent. So this is a long story short, this is a concept that kind of influences a lot of the direction that we're trying to cover here, in terms of creating art from movement, from the dance, and not choosing how the sculpture looks, but more creating systems of design that manifest it onto different formats, quote unquote, effortlessly. So this is a little bit about the project, and I was curious, as things have progressed and evolved, what the process has revealed to you so far.
Yeah, well, first of all, I just have to say that like the way I learned wabi-sabi is that as a foreigner, anytime you will ask a Japanese person what is wabi-sabi, and you will ask them if it's this thing, they will inevitably tell you, no, you don't understand, you know. So you always massacre the term. Don't worry, you know. and me, after spending enough time in Japan, every time that I hear somebody saying the term, also my first reaction is like, no, it's not this. So don't worry about it. My 2 cents about it is though that the wabi-sabi is 2 words, that one of them is naturalness, because it's wabi and sabi, and one of them relates to old age or decay. So like if we make something that like you can see the original material, and also that it doesn't lose its utility or its beauty through old age decay, then it has wabi-sabi. But also, if we had here another participant from Japan, I would probably say that this is also wrong. And I think for me, the process so far has been fascinating. Working with you on this project, it really caught me in an interesting place in my life, because I'm now shifting more and more towards choreography and stopping to perform other people's works as a performer. And I think I already learned a lot about how important it is to bring, like how powerful or potent it is to bring to movement other creative forms. Like basically a lot of what we talked about in order to make this project was from the perspective of you as somebody that has experience in painting and sculpturing, which I also have, but much less than you. And also from the perspective of Pep, which is he's doing the technological work of like kind of analyzing the data into in the making of the sculptures. So kind of for me to realize like, as a creator, just considering my movement from the perspective of a painting, sculpture, and a graphic designer already changes it a lot. So this was already very, very interesting takeaway for me. I have to say that, like, I already said at the beginning, it started very funny, because at the beginning I was like, it didn't make any sense, because I was like, okay, are we gonna record my movement in order to make a sculpture? Wouldn't I just stand in a position like they always did? Like, why not everything needs to be reinvented? But of course, that very quickly I learned that it's completely not the way it is. I'm reading now a very interesting book that really connects me to the project. It's called How to Understand Comics by Scott McCloud. I think it's one of the best books I read about the connection between art and perception, and it's actually a book about comics. And he talks a lot about, like, that comics is static, but the intentions of making time pass, the intentions of emotional tension, the intentions of making you imagine or remember something, how they completely change the creation in comics. And I think that this is something that, like, was kind of actualized through this process, that I couldn't have stood in order to make this sculpture, because it would have been a completely different sculpture. It would be a sculpture of a figure and not a sculpture of a movement. And even now, seeing like how little by little the creation unfolds and what it reveals and what it teaches me about my own movement, because like this I saw now not so long ago the one of the visual representations that you were using in the later phases, and it was crazy how abstract it is, but I could still recognize myself so easily within this abstraction with just directions in space in different colors. I was like, it's so clear that it's me. And this has been it's been fascinating for me, and not only to recognize myself, also to see things that I wouldn't see because of other information that I'm relating to, the shape of my body, my own goals, my own skills, all of these things. Sometimes I see them, I focus on them, and then there's other things that that actually they're very much there, they're very visible, but I'm just like, I don't look for them, therefore I don't see them. So so far it's like there was a lot of learning from it, and I think that I definitely think that something from this creative process also will stay with me to my next creations, of like, taking consciously this position of a painter, of a sculptor, within, even if it's a choreographic work that, like, sometimes deals with the theater, with the movement, with the drama, but still, applying this different perspective is something that, like, I totally see valuable, and I learned a lot from already.
Yeah, and also something that I've been kind of experiencing and reflecting upon in this process as it's been unfolding more and more is this idea of technology as well, and how technology in this case is it's giving us this insight that we didn't necessarily have before to our immediate awareness. It's allowing us to kind of map your movements in over time in the past, and then go back into that, reflect back into that, distill that. There's kind of an alchemy to this, and also in the production of these. So I'm now working with some production companies to have these 3D printed, and again, this is like this whole frontier of technology, which is kind of new to me, kind of exciting to me. A few years ago, just to give a bit of context, like I would really have like I would really like try not to look at my phone for like 3 days, and I had a real like back to nature kind of life experience where I lived in a small corner of Andalusia, and I was living in a tent for 8 months, and then in a small kind of farmhouse for a couple of months, growing my own food with my family there. And it was a real like goodbye to the world of technology and modernism and all this kind of stuff, you know.
Yeah.
Or a temporarily one, you know, just to make a bit of perspective. And
I so envy this story right now after spending a month and a half at home. I'm like, you just say it and I'm like
and yeah, for me it's been this whole kind of reconciliation with tech and the power of tech. And yeah, I don't know if I'm kind of going across too many landscapes now, but I've been also listening to a lot of the zeitgeist movement and a lot of material around, for people who aren't familiar with this, these kind of ideas and propositions for what humanity can be when we really leverage the technologies we have in terms of managing a resource economy, 3D printing houses in the matter of hours from sustainable materials, all these kind of things, you know, automation, that kind of pose a really interesting future. And so as part of this art and my reflection upon it, I guess part of my instinct is to now reconcile this kind of aversion I once had with technology, and especially with art, because going into this, I thought, if it's not handmade, if I didn't do it with my hand, it can't be art. You know? Like, I had this real like a thing I had to get over, and I'm still kind of getting over with it. But now I'm seeing that, oh my God, I'm working with so many people. I have to manage relationships. This is the art, you know. This is the art.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, that was just kind of a reflection, and to see if anything resounded with.
Yeah, completely. I think that, first of all, I think that the point about sustainability is very important because, like, I think that there's a lot of habits that were left from the industrialization that are now basically biting the ass of humanity a little bit. And I think that the progress in technology allows to a little bit minimize, you know, which sounds paradoxical because it was paradoxical in the industrialization when it was more about like more, but now when things can get smaller, less harmful, and you can get a lot of the effects with less resources, or to change even the resources, I think that using technology for more sustainability is extremely important. And I also think that the progress of technology, I hope, would allow also a bit of less misfortunes, because communication becomes so crazy clear and transparent. I mean, even for us, like, a lot of the project has been going on through emails, through recorded calls, and so on and so on. And like I'm witnessing very clearly and very easily all of the steps of the process, which would have been totally impossible if we just jump a couple of years back. Not to mention that even the production of itself is like, we're planning to do basically 3D prints, which is crazy. And it's a very, it is a very efficient, I think, technology. You know, the way that I've seen, the way that 3D prints work and what they're capable of doing. So I am with you as far as, like, you know, being a bit more of a naturalist when I was younger. And I'm still, you know, I still think that there is something about you go to nature, the only thing you see is basically is chance and efficiency. You know, nature is always efficient, and there's always like kind of chance. You know, the leaves fall, they just fall. You know, nobody designs it, nobody, like, you know, manipulates it, and this beauty is all based on this chance and efficiency. But then humans are never only about chance and efficiency. There's always incentives, you know. So, you know, it's interesting, this kind of there is a bridge there that I think that it's very interesting to just reflect on it. And again, I think there's a lot of value in it. I also am completely inspired by our project, and it got me to rethink a lot about the uses that I do with technology. I did a lot of dance films, and for me, always I was like, okay, if we're gonna make a film, it needs to be based on technologies that were present in, like, you know, the cinema of the 40s, long shots, the person that holds the camera actually moves, so on, so on. Like, you know, just this is how you make something feel real. But I am well aware, and I still like this approach, but I'm also well aware that there is magic and there is beauty for the development. You know, like there's amazing art and craft in edit. There's amazing art and craft in effects. You know, and there's ways of doing it that are beautiful and virtuosic and very authentic. So this was something that I also share with you. I think that, and then the last thing is that as a big sci-fi fan, and you know, like one thing that jumped to me already from the data capturing that we did, that I was like, you know, I was with this suit and everything that I was doing was showing on the computer, and I had all these images flashing of a Ghost in the Shell. That is, it's like, which I think is wonderful, and it's also very much connected to the I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, zeitgeist.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think this is also with this, you know, with all of this embracing of technology and how much nowadays we have to accept that it will be present of our life, to keep also acknowledging the risk of having it too present. I don't know, of course, what is the balance, but I think that all of this came more strongly into my life following the project, and actually I'm very, very thankful for all of these reflections, because it is a very prominent topic and something that is very present.
Nice. Yeah, so these the first kind of batch of artwork produced is now on pre-sale on my website, christianchainart.com. So you can find it there. There's two variations of Tom's movements, one called Nautilus and one called Architectonics, and they're available in limited edition. So you can find them there, and I will do a show notes as well. So some of the references that we've talked about, which may be a little bit more obscure or specific, I will write them along with the links and things that we've mentioned. And yeah, I just kind of wanted to do a little bit of a sum up, just to kind of integrate everything.
Yeah.
And finish as well with a game that I prepared. So
sure.
So we've spoken about your background and influence of martial arts in the early days and being exposed to disciplines for discipline's sake, your involvement with Japan and everything it brought to you, and these new reflections and concepts that kind of started infusing their way into your perception, which later were able to flourish in some of the teaching platforms that you've created, movement archery, Zen acrobatics, the natures of partnering. Is that right?
Partnering? Correct.
Yeah.
This I am correct.
Yeah. Which I will put links up to your pages as well in the thing. And we've spoken about technique, about expression, about finding a middle way when it comes to employing strategy and open communication. And so with all of this in mind, the game that I wanted to kind of end on was kind of inspired by like how to finish a long conversation, you know. So I thought in virtue of minimalism and Japan and kind of less is more, I thought we would each just say 5 words that kind of just rolled off our tongue, just to finish this whole thing off. So I will start, okay? 1 second. Time, play, speaking, writing, moving.
Oh, wow. Architecture, art, communication, lines, friendship.
Nice. Cool. And yeah, I think that's it. I think we'll leave it on that note.
I would just like to
Yeah.
add one last thing. That aside from all this project, another project that I would like just to interest our listeners in is the new performance arts company that me and my partner Ruse opened just 6 months ago. It's called the Wonderground Company. We have now two projects that have both been a bit pulled back because of coronavirus. One, Rise, which is a street performance, and one is After the Rain, which is a stage performance that is not finished yet. It will be finished at the beginning of 2021, hopefully. Depends on the epidemics in the world. And also, I invite people to check out our. We have a website, we have an Instagram account, and all of that stuff. And it's just another one of my ways of communicating is through performance arts, and would like to share it with anybody that's interested.
Okay, and I'll put up all the, you can send me later the specific links, and I'll put them all up in the show notes so people can quickly access them from, if they're listening to this and they want to access it straight away, we'll put that in the show notes as well.
Perfect. Great.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you very much.
It was a great honor and privilege to converse with you, and actually do it in a time that it was less extended than I was thinking.
That's true. Thank you. Honor is also mine.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.